This is a study of a road in Mortlake that no longer exists. West Road. The Richmond Herald reported on the 25th of March 1971 that a whole street in Mortlake, housing about 40 families, was soon to disappear. All the properties in West Road would be demolished to make way for the multi-million-pound expansion of Mortlake Brewery. The brewery had stated in a letter to residents that not only would they be evicted from their homes within the year, but that the company is unlikely to have alternative accommodation to offer you. However, tenants were eventually rehoused locally or offered a lump sum payment, and by September 1972 there was only one resident left, Mrs. Mary Fairs at number 10. West Road had existed for a mere 70 years. West Road had been built specifically to house working-class people in Mortlake. The first reference to the road in Kelly's directory is in 1900. There were also a few residents recorded in the 1901 census. The Harris family lived at number 7, for example, and their daughter was a bottle washer in the brewery. This map shows West Road and Fairfax House in 1933. The river is at the top and Mortlake Green is to the south. The road had access to Ship Lane in the east. To the west, it abutted the wall onto Ainscombe Lane. The houses in West Road consisted of 10 detached blocks, each divided into 4 flats, 2 upstairs and 2 on the ground floor. There were 2 internal staircases per block, and each flat measured 25 by 34 feet. This is the 1898 plan drawn by Sanders and Finch, architects of Lincoln's Inn Fields, showing the layout of West Road. And this plan shows the construction details. The houses were brick built on a concrete base. There were 3-inch steel joists supporting the first floor, and iron girders supported the roof. They were well built to a high standard, and according to many residents, felt very sound. They were so solidly constructed that when it came to demolishing the cottages in the 1970s, considerable force and time was required to raze them to the ground. The flats were also well designed. They were compact but practical. Each room had a cast iron fireplace. There were sash windows, and to begin with, all flats were fitted with gas for cooking and lighting, and later electricity was installed. At number 39 West Road, there was a laundry where residents could do their washing and ironing, and it was here that sewing classes for girls were held on Monday evenings. Small back gardens allowed residents to dry their washing and keep all sorts of animals. There were rabbits and chickens and even ferrets. The 1902 Kellys lists the names of residents for the first time, but there are only 22 households out of a possible 38. Frank Wright, living at number 1, was a bootmaker. By 1903, there were 31 households listed in Kellys. There was also a parochial lay mission at number 37. In the next few editions of Kellys, there are no residents' names listed, possibly because in the early history of West Road, it was a private road with iron gates at the Ship Lane entrance, and if the gates were closed, the enumerator from Kelly's might not have been able to gain access to the houses. Mrs. Connie Fancy remembered the main gates only being opened when there was a funeral. And later, Robert Beasley at number 20 remembered that you had to ask Mr. Frank Haddock at number 2 for the key to the main gates. There was also, as we shall see later, multiple occupancy of the flats, which would have made a head of household difficult to identify. So how did West Road come to be built? When the houses in West Road were constructed, the brewery occupied only a part of the current site east of Ship Lane. The western side consisted almost entirely of a number of large houses that faced the River Thames. This map of 1896 shows the area before West Road was built. The land on which West Road lay had a distinguished past. It was once a part of the gardens of Fairfax House. In the 1617 survey of Mortlake, Fairfax House was described as lying behind the yards of both the Blue Anchor, now the Ship Inn, and Church House, now Thames Cottage, stretching almost to the lower Richmond Road and covering 3½ acres. It was then owned by Mr. William Bass. The entrance to the house was on Ship Lane, and the grounds included a barn, outhouses, and an orchard. This line drawing from 1847 shows Fairfax House with the Ship Inn beyond. Fairfax House was a lovely Jacobean mansion built in the Dutch style. The 19th century local historian John Eustace Anderson described the house with the tiled roof covered with ivy, the fine old Jacobean window at the back overlooking the garden, the marble flooring, and the fine old chimney piece in the hall. This is a photograph of Fairfax House taken in the 1860s, rather overwhelmed by ivy. Many distinguished families lived in Fairfax House. Sir Benjamin Hawes MP lived there from 1838 to 1843. His wife, Sophia, was the daughter of Mark Isambard Brunel, and sister to both the engineer Isambard Kingdom Brunel and the artist Emma Brunel. Emma frequently visited Fairfax House in the 1840s. And she painted this watercolour, which is dated 1842 and is signed E.M.B. The house then came into the possession of Mr. Bell. In 1880, he sold Fairfax House to the Reverend Mr. Brown, who had the intention of running a school from there. However, in 1881, before the completion of the sale, and while the house was empty, it caught fire, and the old Fairfax House was destroyed. But not before 9 young men and a manservant stayed there in April 1881. Fairfax House was the temporary home of the Cambridge University boat race crew, which used it as a base until boat race day on the 8th of April 1881. They lost the race, but at least didn't have far to go to collect their belongings, as the finishing post was just opposite the house. After the fire and the boat race in 1881, Frank Whitaker Bush QC bought the land on which the old Fairfax House had stood, and he built a new house on the site, which he also called Fairfax House. He probably took a great personal interest in its construction, as according to Anderson, Mr. Bush was very fond of building and acting as master builder. Whitaker Bush was born in 1825 and had lived at Carlton House, Kew Green. He then moved into the newly built Fairfax House in 1890. Whitaker Bush was described by Anderson as one of the most eccentric old gentlemen we ever had in Mortlake. He added that Whitaker Bush was very kind-hearted, very hard-working, and had a habit of sitting up reading very late at night. This is a technical drawing of Frank Whitaker Bush's Fairfax house. It was a brick-built late Victorian villa. From 1893 until 1898, Whitaker Bush served on the Barnes Urban District Council. He believed that workmen's homes could be built at less cost and therefore be let for a lower rent than those currently provided or proposed by the council. Whitaker Bush acted upon his belief. The council's Housing of the Working Classes Committee met on the 26th of October 1897 and reported that Mr. Bush also submitted sketch plans of semi-detached cottages containing 4 tenements. And this is the architect's 1898 street plan again. In March 1899, the council approved these plans. Whitaker Bush built a double row of cottages on about half of the southern part of his own garden. These homes were for working people to rent, and Whitaker Bush let them out at 5 shillings a week. This was West Road, and these were the 5-shilling cottages. It was said by Anderson that Whitaker Bush spent a few thousands of pounds in this enterprise. He also gave up a significant part of his garden in order to build his cottages. This was a truly philanthropic act. The 1901 census records Whitaker Bush, then a widower, aged 76, as living in Fairfax House with his unmarried daughter Clara and his cousin Marion. Whitaker Bush lived to see his cottages built and tenants installed, but he died in 1903. After his death, there were many residents of Fairfax House, and it was rarely empty. But by 1962, Fairfax House had been demolished. The 1911 census took place when the houses in West Road were about 10 years old. On the night of the 2nd of April 1911, a total of 355 men, women and children were recorded as living in West Road. There were 38 occupied flats, and there was the Lay Mission Hall at number 37 and the laundry at number 39. As we have already seen, the 10 blocks in West Road were each divided into 4 flats. But the census shows there were often 2 families living at a single house number. Only 13 flats contained just 1 family. Each flat consisted of 4 rooms. In the early days, families who shared their accommodation would have cooked their meals in one of their 2 rooms. There was a larder and a coal cupboard. Each flat had an indoor WC, but no bathroom and no kitchen. But a wash house provided cold water and mains drainage, and it also housed a sink and a copper, heated the water for washing. Later, this room would develop into the kitchen. Young children were bathed in the sink, while adults either took their chance in a tin bath in front of the open door of the oven, or walked the short distance to the public baths on Mortlake High Street for a good long soak. From the 1911 census returns, we learn that there are only 5 people in West Road who were aged 60 years or over, and the eldest inhabitant, Josiah Duncombe, was 75. In 1911, life expectancy nationally was 50 years for men, and for women it was 54 years. There were many babies under 1 year old at West Road in 1911, and the youngest to be recorded on that April night was Alice Brown, just 2 weeks old, and the 6th child of Alfred and Emma. The majority of couples had suffered the death of at least one child in the past, but Alice and Josiah Duncombe at number 15 had lost 5 of their 11 children. Amelia and Henry Kettle at number 27 had lost 4 of their 11 children, and Alice and George Ashley at number 24 had lost 3 of their 8 children. Many other couples had lost 2 children. Nationally, infectious diseases accounted for about a half of childhood deaths. However, it was not unusual for there to be several children in one family in West Road. William and Mary Billimore at number 29 had 9 children between the ages of 2 and 25 living in West Road. A further 3 children had already left home and another child had died. A total of 13 live births for Mary Billimore. But Thomas and Caroline Brentnell at number 35 were potentially even more fertile, having produced in just 12 years of marriage 9 children, who in 1911 were aged from 12 to under 1 year. There were 11 households in West Road, headed by a lone parent, both men and women. There were 6 boarders living with families on census night. Not all families were local to southwest London. 10 adults were from Ireland, and others came from all corners of England: Chester, Hadley in Suffolk, Southrop in Gloucester, Norwich, Maidstone, the Isle of Wight, Belper, as well as from a variety of districts in London. Neither were the households all conventional. Josiah Duncombe, who was 75 years old, was an army pensioner born in Bethnal Green. His wife Alice was a needlewoman from Shoreditch. Their unmarried son Herbert lived with them, as well as their 8-year-old granddaughter Florence, who was at school in Mortlake. The Duncombes shared number 15 with James and Rose Young, who had a young son also called James. In addition, the Youngs found room for a boarder, Edward Stevens, who was a 44-year-old widower. A total of 8 people of all ages living and sleeping in 4 rooms. A similarly mixed household lived at number 26. Here Reuben Brown, who was 50 years old and born in Hertford, lived with his wife Fanny. They had a 13-year-old son, Edwin. Reuben had worked in the brewery, but now described himself as a crippled street musician. Also at number 26 were Edmund and Frances Donaher, who had recently had a baby boy. A boarder, James Leonard, a 60-year-old general labourer, also shared their home. Mrs. Mercy Leonard's husband was not included on the census return, but she did describe herself as married. She was living at number 17 and was 26 years old in 1911. She had 4 children under the age of 5, none of them yet at school. Mercy's sister Bridget, who was a domestic servant, also lived in the household. The sisters were originally from Limerick in Ireland. Her husband must have been away for some time, as Mercy had taken in boarders in order to earn an income. On the census form, Mercy describes her occupation as attending to boarders. On the night of the 2nd of April, 3 boarders, all general labourers, were living as part of her household. 9 persons shared 4 rooms. In West Road, there were, on average, 9.3 persons per flat, more than twice the average homes in Mortlake. There were a variety of occupations recorded among the men of West Road. There were 6 painters, a butcher, a sewerman, a window cleaner, a carpenter journeyman, 9 bricklayers, and several men worked in market gardening. The largest category of employment was general labourer. 12 men worked in the brewery. Among the women, most were occupied in caring for the home and their children. Of those who were employed, and these were mainly unmarried daughters or widows, most were domestic servants. However, 12 women worked in laundries. There was also 1 needlewoman, and Mrs. Eliza Hunt, a widow aged 64, was kept by her daughters, who were both laundry hands. This is a photograph of Connie Jeffcott sitting on her mother's lap with her older sister and a cousin outside 25 West Road, taken in 1916. It's interesting to note that the 1911 census form was for the first time completed by a household member, with the enumerator later checking the details. All the forms submitted for West Road were completed successfully, indicating a good standard of literacy and numeracy among the residents of West Road, as well as their ability to understand the requirements and officialese of the forms. The overcrowding in West Road in 1911 is difficult to imagine from our vantage point more than 100 years later, and the living conditions would have been very basic. Between 1910 and 1914, there were waves of industrial unrest in England. Men and women suffered poor working conditions. There had been wage cuts and inflation was high. Keeping the family warm and well fed would have been a constant struggle. But when the weather was fine and all the 184 children in West Road went out to play in the local streets, tiny back gardens and the river, the area must have bubbled with noise and activity. The Great War took its toll on many families in West Road. William and Blanche Southgate, at number 32, had 5 children. 2 had died before the war, and William Jr. was now their eldest son. He became a private and died on the Somme aged 17 in October 1916. Mrs. Ada Woodman, at number 6, was already a widow in 1911. She was bringing up 8 children. 2 of her sons, Frederick and Ernest, enlisted. Frederick in the Army Reserve in 1912, and he was killed in action in September 1914, one of the earliest casualties of the Great War. He was 19 years old. His brother Ernest survived the war. Rifleman William Maher at number 31 was killed in action on the 30th of March 1917. Also at number 31 was William Walland, a window cleaner who lived with his widowed mother. He died in Iraq, aged 24. William Pierce lived at number 7 West Road and died in action on the 7th of June 1917, aged 20. William Pittman from number 21 enlisted in August 1914. He was a labourer who lived with his widowed mother Charlotte. He was 33 years old when he died in June 1915. Anne Purdy was a laundress and another widow living at number 3. Her 3 sons, James, Harry and Frederick, all enlisted. James was killed, aged 27, in March 1918. Harriet Miles at number 13 was yet another widow who lost a son. Private George Miles, a brewery worker, was 28 when he was killed in action at Passchendaele in August 1917. George Kettle was the eldest of 5 sons living with his parents at number 27 and was killed just a few weeks before the war ended in September 1918. Lance Corporal Alfred Hulbert's parents, Alfred and Maria, lived at 30 West Road. Alfred died in action in June 1916, leaving behind a wife and 4 children. The youngest was born just 3 weeks before Alfred died. Frank Haddock, if you remember, lived at number 2 and held the key to the gates for West Road. He came from a large family who had lived in Martha Place, just by Vineyard Path. Frank, along with 6 of his brothers, John, William, Christopher, Arthur, Walter and George, all joined the army. 3 of these brothers, William, Christopher and George, were killed during the war. Frank survived and remained living in West Road until his death in 1965. In total, 10 men died during the Great War from just one modest street in Mortlake. But back to the story of the road. This is the end elevation of one of the blocks. And this, the front elevation. The Mortlake Brewery ceased making beer during the First World War. However, brewing was restarted in 1919 and Watney's continued to expand. In 1919, it brought up most of the land to the west of Ship Lane, including the playing field. Between the wars, overcrowding at West Road eased, although there were still examples of large families and subletting. Mr. and Mrs. Piper at number 23 had 6 children living at home. They sublet 2 of their 4 rooms to the Beasley family, who had 2 children, a total of 12 people to one flat. The Beasley family later moved to number 20, where Robert Jr. remembered selling horse manure from the brewery stables at 2d a bucket. He also remembered the rabbit man who called at the top of the road on Saturday mornings. Rabbits cost 4pence each and made a good stew. Dripping from the local cafe was 2pence for half a basinful. Robert also remembered a time when his school friend Tommy Fares from number 10 fell into the river between 2 barges which were pulled up at Ship Lane Wharf. Tommy was drowned and his body was not found until a week later by Barnes Bridge. He was not the only child to drown in the Thames. Accidents were all too common occurrences. One young lad was holding on to the back of a lorry he was chasing. When he let go, he tumbled to the ground and badly grazed his leg. This became so infected, antibiotics were not available for civilian use at this time, but he had to have his leg amputated. Despite the fact that West Road was embedded into Watney's site, not all the residents worked for the brewery. In 1939, Walter Fares at number 10 was a costermonger who sold fruit and vegetables. Robert Beasley Sr. at number 20 was a dustman. Bob Meakin at number 12 worked at the sewage works. There was overcrowding and stress among and between families, which sometimes resulted in fighting among both the children and the adults in West Road. But families helped each other as much as they could, especially the women who tried to make life as good as possible for their children. When women went shopping and learnt that a butcher had offal off the rations, for example, they would make sure that word spread quickly so that others could benefit. West Road went relatively unscathed in the Second World War and did not suffer direct bombing. But many men were called up, Bill Meakin, Ronnie Fares, Bob Beasley, Jimmy Piper among them. For the children, the war did not impinge on their lives to any great extent. They continued to climb over the high brick walls of the nearby empty Cromwell House and play in its overgrown gardens, scrumping its apples in the autumn. By 1942, Cromwell House had suffered bomb damage, was uninhabited, and became dangerously derelict. But this did not deter the more intrepid children who gained entry to the building and played out adventures in the house itself. Children also swam in the river when the weather was warm enough and would pick up the coal droppings from the barges, delivering coal for the brewery that called at Ship Lane Wharf. Domestic coal was rationed during the war. Families were therefore always short of fuel and would be constantly on the lookout for wood and coal. This is a photograph of Mrs. Margaret Howells with her son Stan outside number 31 West Road in about 1950. Stan was born at number 3, but later moved to number 31 West Road. His grandmother, Mrs. Priest, lived at number 36. 4 generations of the Priest Howells family lived in West Road. On one occasion during the war, Stan, a little boy at the time, went out with a baby's pram and collected coal droppings from near the coal yard by Mortlake Station. He then put them in the pram and covered them up. A policeman came up to him and told him to take his baby brother home, as it was too late for him to be out. Stan ran home with his pram full of coal as fast as his legs would carry him. VE Day celebrations in West Road. David Norman lived at number 6. His father George worked at Weybridge during the war, where he repaired damaged Wellington bombers. There was gas street lighting in West Road until the early 1950s, and David recalled that a man with only one leg would come round in the evenings on a bike with a large pole to light the gas lamps. Watneys continued to expand west of Ship Lane and bought the land on which West Road stood. By early 1971, the residents of West Road had begun moving out, and the community dispersing as the houses became due for demolition. The families in the houses on the south side were the first to leave, and it was these houses that were the first to be demolished. Mrs. Margaret Howells at number 31 had worked in the bottling unit at the brewery and was rehoused in Riverside House, now Varsity Row, on Thames Bank. Mrs. Maud Beasley had lived in West Road since she was a schoolgirl and was one of the last to leave. This is her with her son Robert outside number 20 West Road in 1971. Mr. Ernest Grant, also one of the last to be rehoused, had been born at number 4 West Road in 1902. He and the road had been together for 70 years. In September 1972, Mrs. Mary Fairs at number 10 was the last surviving resident to move out. She had lived in the road for 54 years. This is a photograph of Guildford House, which stood at the top of Ship Lane. The houses in West Road are being demolished on the left. The last of the houses was demolished in 1973, with considerable difficulty, according to many eyewitnesses. They had been so soundly constructed. New offices and buildings associated with the brewing process were erected on the site. Once a new wall had been built along Ship Lane, all evidence of West Road had gone. Not even a footprint of the road remained. But in the words of Ernest Grant, it will take a lot of knocking down, but it will always live in the memories of the families who had lived there. The story of West Road is one of hardship, of overcrowding, hard work, poverty, birth and death. But for many of the families who lived in West Road, there were also the fond memories of a tightly knit community, and much regret that the road and its houses no longer exist.